everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Sarisha and I'm on the Almeida Theatre's Youth Board. The Youth Board is a group of 18 to 25-year-olds working with the Almeida to provoke, inspire and create positive change at the theatre. We're here this afternoon to explore the making of the Almeida's production of Albion. The production was first staged in 2017 and brought back to the theatre in February 2020, when it was filmed by the BBC and aired on BBC iPlayer in August 2020. Schools are now able to access the recorded production for free, details of which will be available for everyone in the chat. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing the creative decision-making process with the team behind the show, and we're so excited to have this opportunity to be speaking with such a highly experienced panel and to be able to offer this as a resource to students and teachers. So today we have with us Rupert Goold, the director of the show, and also Rupert is the artistic director of the Almeida Theatre. We have Miriam Buether, set designer, Neil Austin, lighting designer, Rebecca Frecknall, movement director. Rebecca is also associate director of the Almeida Theatre. Tom Brennan, the associate director, Dónal who played Gabriel in the show, Margot Leicester, who played Cheryl, and Helen Schlesinger, who played Catherine. You can find everyone's full biographies and credits also in the chat. So thank you to everyone, firstly, who has sent in questions. We've tried to incorporate them all into the panel, and by the end, hopefully we'll have answered them all for you. But if there is anything else you'd like to ask, there will be an opportunity to squeeze in a few live questions at the end of the discussion using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So let's get started. Really excited to get going. So let's start by talking about the concept behind the production, your overall creative vision and the process you went through to bring the themes to life on stage for us. So Rupert, hi. What were the key themes that you wanted to highlight when creating the play, and how were you influenced by the overall context of Brexit and UK politics at the time?
Thanks, Sarisha. Yeah, the one person who's not here is Mike Bartlett, who's the writer, whose real vision the whole play is, of course. But I think the start of it, I mean, it had many different starting points, but one of them was a play that Mike and I had done also at the Almeida a few years earlier called King Charles III, that actually Margot was in, that took it took the current royal family, Prince Charles, William, Harry, and rewrote a story about them in a sort of Shakespearean format using blank verse. And it was surprisingly successful because it was an odd idea. But I think the idea of trying to look at a modern story, a story about the world we live in now, using an old dramatic form was something that Mike was interested in and that we were interested in. And so I think a big part of the formal inquiry of the play was to do with the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, who wrote a number of famous plays, but particularly a play called The Cherry Orchard. And there are certain things you find in Chekhov plays that you will also find in Albion. For example, characters who are longing to get back to the city. In Chekhov, it's Moscow, but in our play, it's getting back to London. The idea of a family stuck in a country house, maybe hoping to revive it, but the country house's fortunes having fallen on hard times. The idea that family might represent a class of people who maybe change or revolution was coming towards. The idea that the characters of a play will include both the sort of, I guess, the kind of more affluent people who might own the properties, but also the people who work for them, the servants. And then also within Albion, there are a number of plot lines that almost directly relate to plays in Chekhov. So the relationship between Helen's character, Catherine, and Zara, it relates to a relationship in The Seagull between Trigorin and Nina about a controversial writer who comes to this country estate, and the young girl on the estate falls in love. It's with him in that case, and in this case it's with a woman. So so there was a kind of formal inquiry about, can you write a Chekhov play now? And I suppose behind that also was the idea that, as in Chekhov's plays, there's a revolution is coming to the ruling class, and the Russian Revolution is around the corner and about to destroy a kind of set of values. I suppose in some ways the play is looking at, is a revolution coming to these people, or are they the beginning of a revolution? And certainly when the play first came out, it was just quite soon after the Brexit referendum, and I think the play was looking at some level, the garden itself in the play representing England and the idea of Englishness. And I'd say the second big theme in it is really around the idea of nostalgia. And I think that we were interested in nostalgia, which, you know, being romantic or sentimental about the past, being a very important part of patriotism, but also nationalism, which had been on the rise through the last 5 years, both in this country and in America and all over Europe. And I think we felt that obviously what happened with populist leaders like Donald Trump in America was that maybe worlds or communities that felt intimidated by globalization and the internet age reached back to an idea of their past to try and redefine themselves, and that maybe that was what was going on in Brexit, that sort of some idea of like a glorious past, a glorious English past could be recovered. And so that idea of what nostalgia is, what it means to people in relation to their country and their land, obviously things like war, but also literature and culture being part of that national identity, I think was the other big theme. Sorry, long answer.
No, thank you. That was great and really interesting, especially some of those kind of big themes that you mentioned about revolution coming to the ruling class, and kind of how that relates to a play and a production that's set in quite a domestic setting of the garden, and how you brought that kind of to life for us, and those themes kind of running as undercurrents throughout. I'm really interested to know, maybe Tom, what kind of early conversations you had following on from those themes. What were the early conversations that you had as a creative team about how to bring those themes to life on the stage, again within the setting that you were in?
Well, one of the really early moments of rehearsals, we went to visit a country garden, an English country garden, which was, I think, a really magical day for everyone, because, I mean, for a number of reasons really, but there's that sense of continuity in a space like that, this kind of historical continuity, that we're going to like retain something, and that to preserve something takes a really long time and takes a lot of effort. So that sense of kind of, you know, I've never really, it's only in lockdown I've been like gardening and feeling like, God, it all just takes a long time for like my little beetroots to grow. And that sense of pace, I think, you know, that those Chekhov plays, you know, if I think, you know, Act 2 of the Chekhov is a lot of people lounging around in the sun. And this play shares a lot of that quality of, you know, going, okay, we're basically watching people, we're watching the sun come down, and we're watching these people interact slowly. And at some point they're going to have tea, and at some point they're going to have their gin and tonic. But so that's finding that sense of kind of drive through essentially people passing the time. I think going to that country estate and seeing the gardens there was really informative, because they were dealing with the passage of time in a really different way that felt particularly English and particularly rural, in a way that we might not have accessed had we not been there, I think. And Miriam's design, the sort of the growth of the garden that you see through the production, feels like you get such a sense of that passage of time. And Mike said early on is like that part of the joy of watching these kinds of play is just working out how everyone relates to each other, and at different moments, and then act by act, you're working out, oh, this has changed. Something's happened between the acts, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And I'm just doing this kind of detective work as an audience to work out what has changed from act to act. So I think that sense of passage of time, as it relates to a kind of English rural space, felt quite resonant at that point.
Thank you. I want to pick up on something you said about kind of being in lockdown, watching it now, and that kind of experience. Obviously the play first came to the theatre in 2017, and then back again in 2020, and there was obviously a passage of time there, and I'd like to pick up upon. But also now that we're watching it online, we're in a completely different circumstance. We're a few years on from the Brexit vote. We're kind of right in the middle and right in the beginning of that. And paired with the experience of the set and that design in the theatre of the tree and the flowers, which is almost a multi-sensory experience that you get from that. How do you think the play resonates or might resonate differently watching it from a 2020 standpoint online, in terms of kind of experience, but also experience of those themes? Tom or Rupert, whoever wants to pick that one up.
One of the things I like most about the film is that is you can see the audience. I find it very moving seeing a bunch of people in a room that you can't have anymore. And I think the the biggest challenge for the piece definitely was the design by a long way, because the play says you have to go through 4 seasons in one evening, and that was going to be very demanding. And one of the things I think is sad that you can't experience in the film is the smell of the earth in the flower beds. It was multisensory in that sense, and for a long time we tried to get real grass as well, but in the end we didn't think we could maintain it properly. But I think the play also, I think Mike would like to say that the play addressed a divided country, and particularly in the relationship between Helen's character Catherine and Audrey, played by Victoria Hamilton, representing, I guess, to some extent, 2 sides of the culture wars that we are in between the left and the right. He wanted to write a play that could try and make people understand the other side a bit, I suppose. And I think that's a really important, gesture about theatre, as you come together in a room and try and make sense of the ideas you don't agree with, and to try and understand the people behind them a bit more. And that feels like super pertinent now.
Yeah, definitely. I to echo that, I think I really, watching the video, I really hear, again, that sense of grief and nostalgia in the play, that, Audrey has lost her son in a war, and just that sense of needing to return to some sort of control. And I think all of us during this time have kind of had a very loose relationship to control over our lives. And so that sense of needing something with order, that I can understand that, again, this idea of tears at this time and gin and tonics at that time, I hear the intensity of like that ritual, kind of, that feels quite hot and quite scary to me, that, the strength of that we will have gin and tonics on the lawn at this time. I think there's something that we're all kind of reckoning with in terms of, people not willing to let go of those kinds of rituals and other rituals in relation to our national identity, I guess.
Thank you. Miriam, I think that that kind of leads us on really nicely to talk about your job and your role as the designer for the production, and kind of your role in bringing the creative vision and these themes to life for an audience physically on stage. Could you talk to us a little bit around decision making for some of your choices for staging this production, particularly around the set, and also the importance that the single setting brings to the play?
Yeah, so we looked at, when we started designing it, we looked at different different audience configurations, and we arrived at this Rust. So we tried different versions, we tried end-on, and we arrived at this Rust configuration partly because it was an outdoor space, and that's a real challenge for a designer to create a believable outdoor space inside a theatre. And because it is a garden, it just felt right. It's a very open space, and it felt right not to close it off with walls. And we also wanted the audience to be quite close and to be sort of part of it and not lean back into darkness. And like Rupert says, because because of their proximity to the set, they could sort of feel, smell the flowers and feel the earth. And that was very important because it was a living set, basically. So it felt really important for them to be part of it. Yeah. And I think, the whole idea of creating a living set was very challenging because you know, I was very keen to use real flowers, and obviously we didn't want to kill them every night. So we had to really think about how that could be done, and how they could be planted every night in pots by the actors, taken out again. There was a very complicated choreography which we had to, you know, which Rebecca worked out, and we had a little plant hospital on top of the Almeida roof. So when plants, we had a lot of spare plants. So when plants looked ill or needed more attention, they went up to the hospital, and others who had recovered came down. So yeah, it was a real challenge to, you know, go through these 4 seasons in 2.5 hours every night.
Were there any, what were your kind of motivations behind using real flowers and a real set? And was there any kind of, was any particular symbolism behind the flowers that you did use?
Well, I think he specified in the play. Mike writes about the red garden, and he sort of, you know, talks about specific colors. And so I actually looked at it. I worked with a gardener, and we really worked out a whole layout of these bays, you know, of these flowers, how certain colors, the green followed the red, followed the orange, went into yellow, which then at the first time the actors were planting it, it all went to pots because it all ended up slightly chaotic. But yeah, it was all, you know, it was all worked out like you would find it in a real garden. And I think generally I tend to, I like sort of sets which look truthful. You know, I don't really like sort of pretend sets. So for a long time, I was resisting the tree, although Mike, obviously, specifically the writer, asked for the tree, but I wasn't sure if he could pull this off and make this look good, like make this look like a real tree. I think in the end they did a pretty good job. But like Rupert says, we also explored real grass, but that had all sorts of problems with the rain and actors, you know, slipping. We thought that would just turn to mud, so we ended up using a fake grass, but we, you know, treated it so it looked real. But it was very, because the audience sits so close to the flowers, that was really important, that was you know, a real element in the earth.
Can I just say something about so the garden that Mike based the play on that we went to see is a garden called Hidcote, which is in I think Warwickshire, and it was made by a gardener in the 20s, I think, a bit like the like in the play, someone who'd come back from the war. And there was a sort of theory that was brought in by this gardener around creating rooms, that a great garden would have smallish rooms that had very strong flowering identities rather than a big open sweeping space. And this red garden, I think, I might be wrong on this, but I think again is based on Hidcote, was this relationship of the fallen and the dead, and the symbolism is very much related to blood and I suppose, like we think about poppies now being associated with First World War and mourning, and so that was the sort of dominant colour scheme we used. So I'll just add.
Great, thank you. Were there any other design ideas or alternative options that you explored before landing on that final design?
Yeah, for a long time we had this end on like a normal theatre. I felt like the big challenge was always going to be the season change, and I suppose I was kind of influenced a lot by the German choreographer Pina Bausch, who often in her stage shows will do transformations of the space that maybe take 5, 10, 15 minutes even, where all the cast totally transform all the, you know, from one color entirely to another color, or they get rid of 1,000 chairs or something. And it's a very, I always think in theatre, that's a very amazing thing when you see something happen in real time in front of you, because we're so used on screen to seeing things being edited that way. So the challenge of, I mean, Tom and Frecknall know better than I will, but I think there were maybe 300 plants or something that were planted in the space of the length of that song. And just the two things I love about that. One is that it's an amazing thing to see happen in real time in front of you, but also I think because the play has lots of scenes with 2 actors in or 3 actors in, it's great for any production to have one thing that everybody does, whether it's a dance or a song or a piece. And in this case, it was a planting. And it's, I think what I really like was seeing the ensemble work together. So you got the whole community doing a thing, which maybe naturalistically those characters wouldn't really have been planting necessarily, but the audience could sort of see the actors move through the space and reflect on what their characters' journeys might be and how they might be changing between the acts. So once we'd kind of committed to the idea of doing it live rather than maybe kind of closing the stage or bringing a curtain across and changing everything, then that kind of dictated the thrust, the sort of in the round shape you see.
We also actually at some point had a ceiling in the design. Do you remember that, Rupert? We had, because it is an outdoor set, we thought we might need something which gives us an idea of a sky, but then that didn't work with a tree, so that went.
Thank you. So Neil, that kind of brings us on really nicely to talk about lighting, because
yeah, doesn't it? Because I didn't want a ceiling on it at all. A ceiling would have made it a nightmare for the lighting designer. So I was very glad when that bit got cut.
Yeah, and also your job, I guess, as the lighting designer, in a show where there's single setting, but very much needs to move between time and different seasons, that kind of then falls very much to the lighting to really convey that to the audience. So I was wondering if you could talk us through your technical process behind conveying setting with light. Yeah,
sure. So I mean, you know, in order to portray all those different seasons, there's only a certain amount that could be changed, and the plants were a major element of that. But the lighting is the thing that can transform in an instant the feeling for an audience of that garden being in the winter on a very, very cold day, through to it being summer, through to it being a gorgeous sunset, through to the nighttime. In fact, you know, we'd had that scene. I think it was Act 3, wasn't it? This sort of early September scene, and it rolled from a September sunset through to a nighttime scene where there are candles and lights being brought around on stage. So that's the gift of lighting, is it can very quickly transform a setting to aid an audience understand time, location, and also the mood of the piece. You can also use lighting to subliminally transform the audience's feelings about a moment because of the way you are lighting it or lighting the characters, the color you're using. The colder the color, the sort of less comforting it is for an audience to watch. And so they don't necessarily notice that immediately, but they will feel that subconsciously. But yeah, so in this piece, with the audience all the way around, from a lighting designer's point of view, that makes it very hard. Thank goodness there was no ceiling. That would have made it even harder. But one of the problems, technically with having audience all the way around, and especially audience raised up on a stage, and the actors raised up on a stage and the audience sitting so close to them, low down, is that in order to light an actor whose face is up here on the edge of the stage, when there's an audience there, means that you're illuminating those members of the audience as well and blinding them. So you need to be very careful of that. That was one of the challenges. But the other challenge was, how to create the sense of movement of time, which we did in that transition that Rupert was talking about, that sort of Pina Bausch transition. One of the ways of visually keeping that stimulating through the 2 minutes or whatever it was, 2.5 minutes, was we did a sunrise from behind the tree through to daytime, through to sunset, through to night, that kept rolling round as though days and days were passing, to help that idea that whilst you're watching this happen in 2.5 minutes, actually what it's signifying is an entire change of season and many, many days and months passing. So that was one of the other interesting technical challenges and moments that the lighting could help.
I'm also very glad you didn't put a ceiling in, because when I went to see it, I was sat on the balcony. So I watched the whole play from bird's eye view, and literally felt like a bird kind of watching over the action from the sky. And it was really, really interesting to see the play like that. Neil, what were some of your favourite lighting states or moments to create in this piece?
I think that rolling kind of time-lapse effect of sunrise through to sunset, through to night, because that, you know, involves everything. That involved angle of light to signify, you know, the height of the sun, the color differences, and it became a you know, a moment to really play with how to manipulate light on a stage and manipulate what the audience understood, I hope, what was being done there, and didn't just think a whole bundle of lights were flashing on and off. I hope that they realized that this is a sunrise to sunset through to night and back again. That was the fun moment. Is
it worth saying something about Gobos, Neil? I was just thinking about how they're slightly out of fashion and how important they were.
Yeah, so I mean, normally I would never allow Gobos. So Gobos, I presume everyone learns about it at school. It's a metal cutout that goes in a light to give shape. So rather than a complete circle of light, you get speckles of light. One of the ones you can stick in a light is makes it look like leaf break up, as though light is coming through a tree. And normally I wouldn't use those at all, but because we had that tree on set, and because of the audience sitting all the way around, I felt it was quite useful to break up the light and have a slightly scattered, dotty, as though there was more than that one tree, as though there was a huge amount of plant and vegetation around. And that became, it became a good way of managing to illuminate the space without making it too bright, because of course it's both light and dark in speckles across the space.
And also, just to add, I don't think there were any leaves on the tree. Were there leaves on the tree? I can't remember.
There were.
There were,
yeah,
were
yeah. We had lots of leaves.
Sorry. My bad.
Yeah,
that was the lighting that made you think there were none, Rupert.
It is a way of making you feel like there are more leaves or less.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. Thinking about that particular transition, Rebecca, could you talk us through your approach to devising particular movement pieces, and specifically that kind of that planting community field transition, and how you you know, what was your starting point, and how did you get there with the actors?
Yeah, well, I mean, the starting point is the sort of challenge that Mike, the writer, sort of puts in the play, and which Rupert's already touched upon, but this idea of the garden has to grow and then has to die as the seasons move through the acts of the play, and there'd been a decision made that would be done live. So I guess those were the two provocations I was given. The sort of I have to make the passages of time really clear, and I have to create one transition where the garden is fully planted by the end of it, and then one where it's fully dug up again at the end of it. So in a way, there are really clear kind of parameters of what has to be technically achieved, and then we started going about them really simply, because there's quite a lot of people on stage at once, taking these different journeys around the space and knowing they've got a certain amount of time to either plant or dig up, depending on which transition you're in. So we started really simply with having everybody sort of had two areas of the stage that they knew they were going to be responsible for planting, and everybody had a sort of a journey through the space and an order through the space, and we played with that as a very, very simple sort of roadmap, I guess, through the transition. So we started from just going, we're just going to enter and we're going to do the journeys, and we're going to mark how long we think it will take to dig, because one of the challenges is we had to rehearse it without any of the actual plants or any of the soil. So lots of people were sort of taking empty plant pots and then guessing how long it might take them to actually plant them, and then kind of carrying on. So there was quite a lot of guesswork. So the first task was looking at the first transition, which was the planting, was about how elegantly and how confidently we can achieve this sort of journey, these multiple journeys to the planters and back again. And once we'd worked that out, then we were able to kind of add in more layers of detail. For example, okay, on your journey, are there moments where you pass another character, and do you know, are there any moments of connection or not? And I think we were quite keen, Rupert was quite keen, as was I, to keep it feeling quite light and quite casual and not like a kind of dance sequence. So there's something quite functional about the first one, and a lot of the movement is, as Neil talks about, is happening in the lighting design as much as it's happening on stage. So those two things are working together. And I think also when you're working with creating these sequences, because you're traveling across seasons and you're also traveling across atmospheres and emotional transitions in the story of the play. So the first transition with the planting, there's something about moving into summer, something hopeful that's about growth, and the project is going well at that point. And then when you come to the next kind of big ensemble movement transition, it's the opposite of that. You're going into winter, they're digging up the garden, it's the plan hasn't worked and the family are moving out. And so that the movement in that transition takes on a really similar sort of sensibility, that there's a sort of casualness to the journeys across the space, but it begins much more ritualistically. So the ensemble all come out and they all stand together and they bend together to take the plants. And I guess that was some of the movement elements and ideas of that were taken from something that felt a bit more funereal and a bit more ritualistic and a bit more solemn. So it's a bit more united in the second half. And also Neil and I worked together to pick these moments out where you have moments just where characters are paused in the movement and are highlighted by the light. And therefore that just gives some space for the audience to connect with that character's journey, because they've sort of spent the whole year now with those characters. So it's a combination of having a practical task you have to achieve, but also an emotional and atmospheric journey that you're trying to help the company and the play kind of go through.
Were there any other kind of significant moments or sequences that you really enjoyed creating, or you might have found particularly challenging to create?
Yeah, there's a sequence that happens in the rain with the character of Anna, and that was really fun to create, but really challenging, partly because of some of the things that were written in the stage directions that had to be achieved. Sometimes a playwright writes something that then actually when you do it on stage, it doesn't quite have the effect that you know the writer's sort of going for. So there's a sequence in the play where Anna sort of almost has she has this sort of dance in the rain, which is kind of an outpouring of grief in some way, and at the end of it she finds the sort of ghost of James, and it was written in the script originally that she was going to sort of dig into the earth and pull him out of the garden. And I remember we had rehearsals where we'd created a whole kind of, there was a bigger trough at one, like near the tree, so there was a whole bit Miriam had designed that was having to be a bit bigger in the flower bed in order to try and pull Will the actor through it. And there was a sort of, we created this mesh and trying to sort of make that land and have the kind of emotional impact that you could see Mike was trying to get was really hard. And also it ended up this bit in the design that was like waiting to happen because it was different to the rest of the flower bed, and so it kind of felt like it was waiting for a set piece to happen. So actually we kind of worked to change where he appears from, and we kind of found a way that he could appear from behind the tree without anyone seeing him. And so that was a kind of interesting moment where I worked very closely with those actors, but also with Miriam and Neil, to kind of create this reveal moment where suddenly this soldier runs out and the audience didn't see him coming, and you're suddenly transported to a war zone. And it's I always found that a really kind of, I was always really pleased by how surprising that always felt in that moment of the show. And it was a real moment where all the creative teams had to kind of really work out how to make that moment land and kind of make it together. And it's the final thing that happens before the interval as well, so you kind of need to really land it well, because everyone's going to go and talk about it in the bar afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. That was a scene that really particularly stood out for me when I saw it. Is there, so you mentioned kind of you tried to start with pulling him out of the ground, and that didn't quite work. How much does the movement work evolve throughout the process, from kind of conception to rehearsal room to tech rehearsal to the final performance?
It's evolved a lot, especially on, it always does, because the movement has to evolve as the whole production evolves. Otherwise the production can outgrow choreography really quickly, because if you just stick to your first idea and then the actors are spending 5 weeks honing detail in their character, the movement world has to do that as well, in order to kind of match how brilliant they are on stage. So the way that the movement was created really evolved in that I would create something with the actors, and then Rupert would come and look and kind of give a sense of what he felt, what was working, what wasn't working, other ideas, and then we do another sort of sketch. It's almost like, I always think of it as like drawing, that you do a first sketch and then you refine it and you do another sketch. And so we could get as far as we could get working like that in the rehearsal room, and then once we got onto Miriam's set, you're then having to rework it all again, because suddenly you have the real plants now and you have the real soil, and actually planting 6 plants takes a lot longer than you thought it might do, and so having to re-choreograph and make changes very quickly to try and achieve the same flow you made in the rehearsal room, but now it's much more complicated for the actors to achieve. And similarly, having to work in the rain, you can choreograph something, and actually that piece originally had a lot of very fast pace running in it, where Angel would run rings around the stage and really go very fast, and it was really exciting. And then I remember getting on stage and we ran the rain for sort of 5 minutes, and I tried to do it and it was just really dangerous, so we had to change that very quickly so that she felt that she could again achieve that emotional connection, but safely. So there are lots of things once you actually get in the room and you work out how different the movement needs to be, and then there's always that stage of reworking things, or just making changes that you see something different in the space, and it would be better actually if they came from here, or if they did that bit quickly, or it feels too long now, so can we make it shorter, or actually, we can sit with it longer so we can take our time. So there's always that thing of you can try and make things as real as they will be in the rehearsal room, but ultimately when you get on the sets, it can all change.
Thank you. Kind of sticking with rehearsal, Dónal, what was a typical day of rehearsal like for the play? You know, who was in the room? Was Mike there, the writer? Were there other creative team members there? Could you talk us through what a typical day looked like?
Yeah. Well, I guess I had a slightly different experience to both Margot and Helen, because I was in the 2020 cast, and so Margot and Helen and a number of other people had the experience of doing the play back in 2017. So I guess in a way there was a feeling of catch up, and kind of getting stuck into something that is already maybe tight-knitted or has a feeling of family. And we were, myself and Daisy and Angel and Jeff, we were lucky to have Rupert and Tom. So Tom, we spent a week with, kind of engaging in maybe decisions that they had made creatively about the life that that the family had. And I guess, so we had a couple of days with Tom, and then Rupert, we'd run the scene, and then we'd stop and have a conversation about maybe relationships, or what I guess we found really useful was in the later stages how time passes between the acts, and maybe any correspondence that we've spoken about, whether that would be how Gabriel might have spoken to Zara while she's away, or how Anna and Gabriel become friends and what leads them to develop their own connection by the end of the play, and investigative questions like maybe how far away Gabriel lives from the garden, and so what it might feel like to walk back and from the house, and just, I suppose, those kind of questions and those conversations in rehearsal help to enrich maybe deliveries of certain lines, like speaking about maybe the characters' ambitions for themselves helps to kind of flesh out the feeling of Gabriel wanting to pursue creative writing instead of English literature, and the characters' hopes and aspirations. Yeah.
Thank you. Helen, what excited you about being in this production, and did you initially in 2017 and then kind of coming back to it again a few years later, what was that like?
Well, I suppose initially the play, well, altogether the play really, you read the play and sort of, I think we all sort of fell in love with the play, and so the writing and the characters, and then the theatre. I think partly I was thinking it's very attractive to be in a play, a little bit like a Chekhov play, where everybody where it's a true ensemble. So there's a number of characters and they all have a voice. And that is going to make for a very happy rehearsal and production experience, because there isn't a sort of sense of some people have a voice and other people don't. There are connections between the characters are very strong. That also means you're going to have a happier experience. But I suppose it was the writing, really, the combination of passion and wit in the writing that's sort of so enjoyable. This coming back to it, I guess a big thing is that you just, if you've done it before, you just feel a bit more relaxed. The first time you're relatively terrified with any new project, but it's great to come back to something, particularly if you've enjoyed it, and have another go. It's often, often get the chance to have another go at something. So, and then the combination of sort of people that and also new injections of energy, the new people, means that you're not just going over something that you've done before, you're sort of reinventing it as well. And everyone's, 2 or 3 years older, so that makes a difference.
Thanks, Helen. Margot, did you experience a similar kind of feeling coming back to the play, and how do you you prepare for your role as Cheryl for the 2017, and then were there any changes for that, or did it feel like just kind of coming back to something that you were really familiar with?
Sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah. I think I never really, the big difference and the great interest for me was that in between doing the play in 2017 and indeed now was that I had little baby granddaughters arriving from beginning to end and running around in a garden. And it's really interesting to me now, as Dónal said, or Tom said, we've probably all spent a lot more time physically in a garden since we last did this play or saw it. And what I used to love about the play was the way Mike and the design and the direction and everything put our bodies, the human body, in nature, in a garden, and with all the kind of transformative things that come off that. When Rupert was saying the guy who came back to Hidcot and built those gardens, I believe, was pulled out of a wagon on its way to the morgue because someone saw his limb twitch and realized he was still alive. So he literally was brought back to life, brought back as a wounded man to Warwickshire. And I loved the opening of the play with the soldier, the young boy, the young man who Audrey, the mother, loves so much, just loves him. And that, I never used to think about Brexit. It was always a play about love and loss, I thought, which endures in any context. And then I could never bear it at the end. This is going back to the granddaughters, which I think I felt more keenly last year because I had these dear little babies in my life then. Is she actually lets the new life go. She loves the garden and she misses the biggest thing about it. It's a regenerative thing. Things come to life, they mature, they decay, they die, and they're born again. And there's the baby, and she actually lets her, the embodiment, the literal incarnation of her son, walk off the stage in the arms of his mummy. And I used to find that unbearable the second time around. What's great is if a great play moves as your life does and allows you to come in again to it at a different angle, I think. I know that's nothing about Cheryl, but I never think about acting. I haven't got anything to say that's helpful about Cheryl, except it was very nice trotting around, coming on with trays of tea and gin and tonics. I used to love it. But that was just fun. That was great.
What was your, and I'd like to ask all the actors this, your character's relationship with the garden in the play? The garden almost kind of, I think, serves as its own character. How did you feel, how did you relate to that as your character? Margot, while you're, Helen.
It was a source of income, clearly, for the character. Her dear husband was the, the breadwinner through the house, the garden. I don't think they had an ounce of sentiment about it, really, which you can see in the last scene. It will go to new development, or it will be, but they very accepting of it, neither idealizing it nor whatever, very much, I suppose, to carry on the Chekhov thing, a bit like, she'll go back and sit with the samovar. In fact, thank God I didn't have to trundle a samovar on, looking back at it now. They're quite hard to maneuver, aren't they? So I think very much more that eternal nature will endure, but not a very pragmatic approach to the garden. I think those two characters would have.
Yeah, I guess for me, it kind of starts, I always found that because Miriam and Neil and Rupert have done such a good job of mirroring what the kind of the external look of it, of the play is with what's happening to people internally. So you see the garden in Act 1 and you meet Gabriel in Act 1, and there's a sense of like excitement about new people there, and there's, like Tom was saying, that there's a sense of nostalgia, and they talk about what's happened, the village fete, and things that happened in the garden previously, and that rolls on for Gabriel into a job. And I think when we see him in Act 2, and we see after that session of the planting, there's a real pride of place and community, and a sense of responsibility and accomplishment by looking out at what the stage now looks like. And then as the play moves on, I always used to think of a kind of a feeling of loss and disappointment and despair as leaving the garden and like feeling it or treating it like a public park or a waste bin by throwing that cigarette on the ground as he leaves. And there was a version of what happened in rehearsals where in the third act, I threw a beer can on the ground during the festival, but we didn't go with that because I thought that would really upset Miriam and the stage design. And just I suppose because everyone has done such a good job, the external view of this stage does have a good indication as to how the characters feel by the end of the play in general, I think.
I thought that I didn't think that Catherine didn't have very strong feelings about the garden. I think as a sort of metropolitan kind of elite member, it's a bit like she expects to find herself in lovely gardens, having interesting conversations. So, but then at the same time, the garden, I think for her, is very much identified with Audrey. And so kind of Audrey's sort of plans and ambitions for this garden, I think that she, thinks it's all a bit ludicrous, like she's creating a city or something, a sort of rural city or something that is all about her. But I think that she is a bit torn, because she, is in love with Audrey, and so everything that Audrey does affects her very sort of strongly, and so she would feel she would admire the garden and what Audrey's done, because I think that she loves Audrey's sort of passion and her energy, and so it would, I think that the garden, because you're in this garden for 2.5 hours, it kind of works on you. And by sort of Act 3, when you come back to the garden, you're remembering where you started with the garden, and your feelings have become more complicated about it. At the beginning, I thought it was ludicrous, and I remember, like, I would see Zara, if I'd see one of her fag butts, in the garden in the bed, I'd think, great, that's what you do to your mum, you smoke and you throw your fags down, and but by the end, I think that her feelings are more complicated. I think also it's about who. I actually think that although we don't consciously think about the metaphor about the garden being sort of England, there is a sort of, this is my space, no, this is my space. And I would never think about that, I wouldn't think about it from like outside, but I think I had a sense of, this is a bit like anybody might in a garden, this is my garden. And that's, I think she had that sense, whatever space she's in.
Thank you. Rupert, was that a hand?
Yeah, I just thought a couple of little exercises I'd completely forgotten about, actually. That we did one on this, I think we did in the 2017 rehearsal period, where because one of the things you have to work out is what happens between each act, and that's an important, like, a lot of story happens between each act for each character. So one thing we did was we set up email accounts for all the characters, and I asked all the actors to email each other in character about something that would have happened between each act. And some of them were just like work things about, Matthew, can you do some more planting? Or some of them were love letters. Some of the actors were more conscientious about it than others. But I suppose it's a way of kind of creating a sort of reality to the actors' lives between the acts, rather than just the acts you see. So when they come into each act, they have a different, hopefully a richer sense of the journey between each act. But in particular in relation to like how you feel about something like The Garden, we would put each character in the middle of a circle with all the other characters standing around them, and ask each character to make a gesture or say something towards the character in the middle about how they felt about them, and then how that would change, say, at the beginning of each act. So maybe at the first act you might want to go and hug somebody because they're your child, but maybe the events of that act, by the fourth act you might go, oh, I want to slap them or whatever. And I think as an exercise where that can be useful is often the actor is focused on the main character that they're interacting with. So for Catherine, particularly with Audrey, but for example, Will, who played the James, the ghost of James, to have him in the middle and have all of the other actors have to think about what their relationship is to him as an idea, and in some ways he represents the garden, and then to find a sentence or a gesture that expresses where they feel about that character, say at the beginning of Act 1 or the beginning of Act 4, is just a helpful way of making people think about relationships that maybe aren't obvious to them in the play. Maybe a character they don't meet at all during one act, but will help them think about the wider world of the play.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question to anyone, please do send them through in the Q&A feature, and also include who your question is for. So while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I'd really like to ask Rupert and Tom, maybe if you'd like to also come in on this, and perhaps anyone actually who was involved in both productions, what were the differences between the production in 2017 and the production in 2020? Did the play change at all, or was it kind of more or less pretty similar?
There was a little text change around Christina's character, the Polish cleaner, who was going home in the second production rather than setting up a business in England, which I suppose was reflecting the post-Brexit landscape of the idea of immigrants to this country maybe either having to go back or choosing to leave a country that didn't welcome them. But I'd say the biggest was probably the new actors brought new energies and new personalities, and were very different to their counterparts. But they every actor is so different in their sort of atmosphere that was a big change. And I'd say also the audience response, particularly around Audrey, the who buys the house. I think people were much more hostile to her, certainly in the Almeida, in the second production. They found her more grotesque and more ridiculous. And I think probably that was because after 2 years of Brexit being such a headache for everybody, whether you're pro or anti it, it ground on and on and on. And so Audrey, as someone who sort of represented a desire to bring Brexit about, the laughter was different in the audience. I don't know if you guys felt that, Helen, did you? It just felt like the sympathies had moved on a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if, like, having spent that sort of that time with Brexit, it's like everyone could not ignore it in a way that potentially they could have before, or that I felt like it was sadder and wasn't as funny, but in a good way, because it was just, I think, there was something in the atmosphere that surrounded the production, which meant we had to take the conflict between Catherine and Audrey a little bit more seriously, which the kind of atmosphere had changed, certainly.
Helen, did you find any particular differences between the first and the second sections?
I think I would agree with that. I was just thinking how with a play, the audience, you know, when you open a new play, it's a very, very particular, you know, no one knows what this new play is going to be. And so I guess there is something that comes, you know, with that, which obviously is about the time as well, and people's expectations of, you know, is this a play about now? And then later on, I suppose if the play has good reviews, you know, people come knowing, you know, God, I've got a ticket. This is great. I'm seeing Albion. I've heard it's really good. And then the second time round, I suppose people are coming with more knowledge, perhaps. Maybe they didn't see it the first time, or they're coming again. Obviously, there are lots of people coming who are new to it. But I guess people get more relaxed, you know, audiences get more relaxed as you go on. You know, I suppose we're very aware, I think, as actors, very much night to night, how an audience changes. So it can feel, you know, you can feel like you have a very, very quiet audience, or a very sad audience, or an audience that are there just to have fun, depending on what night it is. You know, you can feel like, for example, Monday can feel like a really lively night. And often those nights when it feels very lively are when there's cheap tickets, which mean younger people are there. And Saturday night can feel like it's quite hard work, because maybe people have been in all day and then they have to drag themselves to the theatre. There's this sort of, oh my God, here we are. We had to come out on Saturday night. If only we could be in a restaurant. That, of course, wouldn't be the case now. But yeah, I mean, yeah. So, but I agree. Maybe people didn't like Audrey as much the second time. Maybe that's true. And maybe that's something you would feel if you were in the audience. I couldn't feel that myself. Yeah.
I think it just speaks to like Mike's script a little bit, is that, you know, one of the lines that has been in there the whole time was Zara saying, I think I might be in a bubble. And the first production, we were like, aha, yeah, okay, cool. The second time, like the laugh that received, it was like, yeah, obviously you are, you know. It's like, you know, I think it had a really different relationship to the idea of the elite and the idea of privilege. And
well, maybe that has changed, that that notion of, yeah, because at first, yeah, that sort of thing of, you know, all these white people sitting on stage chatting, yeah.
I think Mike has a prophetic quality to him as a writer, I have to say, going back to King Charles III, which is spooky if you look at when that play was written and what subsequently happened to the royal family in detail. And when the Queen does die, all I would say is brace yourselves in terms of what Mike's written. And I think it was very prophetic when we first did it in 2017, and it was all coming true when we did it a year ago. And it was hard. I don't remember them laughing as much. Nothing really was as funny. Audrey, what would seem ridiculous funny in Audrey 3 years before became sort of spitefully true, I think, in a way. That's also, I think, the genius of Victoria was that she managed to retain still the audience's empathy for the depth and the grief of her loss, and that was held in place, as I imagine Mike wanted us to understand what the emotional drive was behind the Brexit thing, the terrible loss.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's always really interesting with productions that relate to a specific political or social moment in time, and seeing how they might live beyond that moment again a few years later, and the change of context and audience reception. Thank you everyone on the panel. We've got a question from Louise from the audience for Neil. Just lost it. There we go. Can you tell us about the initial process you go through upon first reading the script?
From Louise Bell-Hatchett. I wonder if that's Scarlett, who used to be a DSM, a deputy stage manager. Scarlett, you're relying on the fact that a lighting designer actually does read the script. There is one who shall remain nameless who always said to me, "Why bother? You're going to see a run through at the end of rehearsals anyway." But this one did, and when you read it, what you're looking for is you're looking for the clues of that the writers put in there, like everyone else's, about, you know, actors are going to be looking through there for character. I'm looking through for time of day, location. I'm also looking to see how much I can push against those and maybe help the piece by choosing to do something slightly more dynamic. You know, if you choose to do it at this time of day instead, it could be a far more dynamic, far more interesting light, and it could underscore what the actors are doing and support them in their movement. So that's what I'm looking for as I read it. I'm looking for the indicators that are written, but also how far I can push those to. I get visually bored very easily. I get bored very easily, and so I need a visual interest in a production, and that's what I'm trying to do, is create a dynamic, interesting picture for those people who aren't as deep as other members of the audience. You know, people like my parents who came to this show and failed miserably to understand that there was any Brexit metaphor at all and thought it was just about a garden. But anyway.
Thanks, Neil. We've got time for one last live question from Fernando. For the actors, tell us about a specific challenge or difficulty in your role and how you handled it. Dónal, do you want to start? And then we'll go to Helen and then Margot.
That was Fernando's question. I guess one technical challenge that I came up against early on was, you know, when you're playing a character, you focus on the differences between you and them to kind of balance things out. And the first difference I came up against early on was Gabriel's sense of place and his accent. So while I was auditioning for the part, I travelled out to Oxford, and I used some details in the script to get an idea of where Gabriel might be from. So I looked, he says he can get the bus to Brookes University. So I looked at buses that went past Brookes University, and I thought he probably lived further from Oxford than closer to Oxford. And I looked at where it could be as close as possible to Hidcote. And so kind of arrived at a place that he was from. And then I went out there and I met a really friendly man called William, who worked at WH Smith. And he recorded a bit of a speech for me so that I could listen to how he spoke, and I had a chat with him. And that helped me connect to, I suppose, a sense of place, and also to understand how Gabriel might talk, and then I guess, you know, because in the view of what how Gabriel was perceived by maybe London audiences, he might have been perceived as being from the country, and then I feel like that I kind of got for free because I grew up in a rural locality in Ireland, and so I kind of understood what that feeling was like. But yeah, one challenge I guess was the accent, and that's how I worked on it and overcame it. And by doing that as well, you get a sense of, by going to places like the Costa Coffee place that I imagined he worked at in Oxford, or by seeing Brookes University campus and getting a prospectus, you kind of, it feels like you can pad out the images that you have in your head when you say those things, and that they feel a bit more real or live to you. Yeah, so I suppose making sure that all the references that Gabriel had, like UCAS and all those things, they felt kind of certain to me. And writing as well. I suppose I wrote, I imagine what it would be like to be a writer just by writing kind of short stories in the dressing room between shows.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I think like like Dónal, playing a writer seemed challenging. I don't know why. I guess you feel a bit, I don't know, it makes you feel, I don't know, something quite abstract about it, or you makes you feel self-conscious. I don't know. But anyway, that was something that I found challenging. So you know, I wrote a few novels, and no, I didn't actually write anything like that. But I did read a lot. I read quite a lot of writers talking. There's loads of like writers, they're always talking about their work and how they write. I think writers are quite obsessed with how they write and why they write and what makes them write and their writing day. And so I sort of thought about that a lot, and that was very helpful.
Thank you. Margot?
Yeah, I'm sorry to be so mundane, but I swear to God, it really was moving swiftly up the stairs, steps onto the stage with my arms holding a brace of plants, moving at the right time to the right space, planting the plants, getting off again. Rupert knows this, and Rebecca, it was beautifully choreographed, but it was the kind of how to get on in the dark and be ready and braced with your plants for the scene change. That remained a challenge every night, and one I was glad to have, but that's what sticks out in my mind. And it was beautiful to be part of. I think that was a great point, Rupert. Yeah, to have us all suddenly moving in an ensemble way was a lovely counterpoint to the one-to-one, one-to-two conversations that we had within the scenes. It was lovely.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, I'm going to ask everyone on the panel to give a really quick fire piece of advice to a young person who would want to pursue your career today. And I'm just going to go in the order that everyone is on my screen. So if it could go Rebecca, Rupert, Miriam, Helen, Neil, Dónal, Tom, and then Margot to end the panel today. Thank you.
I would say read a lot of plays, a lot of different plays, try and work out which ones you like, and then try and dig into why, and see if those answers to those why questions keep coming up. And I think that tells you quite a lot about the kind of theatre you want to make, and then that will give you a real kind of something to aim for when you're starting to explore working on plays.
I would say there are lots of different roles in putting plays on. You know, everyone starts out being an actor at some stage probably, and lots of people move to other things. And don't be afraid to try them all, and you'll sort of know when one feels right, if it's right for you. And I was desperate to be an actor, and it never felt right. And then the moment I started telling people what to do, I suppose, but also listening to actors, it kind of felt right. So trust your instinct, I think, about it. And if none of them feel right in you, then probably look for something else. But if you love doing it, pursue it.
Is it me? Yeah, similar to Rebecca, I think see a lot of plays, and also see a lot of different directors and approach young directors you like. Don't necessarily wait for them to call you, you know, try and really get out there, and also see a lot of European plays. Yeah.
I don't know who's next, but I'll get it. It's the same thing. Rebecca says read. I, like Miriam, being a visual person, say go and see. See as many places as you possibly can, as much theatre as you can, because if you don't like going to see theatre, if you don't like sitting in a theatre in every spare moment of your time, you probably aren't going to have a career in theatre. You need to be able to sit there loving it from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. at night, or 8 a.m. till midnight in America. That is how long you work in this business, 6 days a week. You need to love it. You need to love the medium.
I would always say go as well, but right now that seems harder. So reading can always be done in your bedroom.
And there's so much great theatre online. Like Miriam says, so much wonderful European production if you look around online. And also I'd say, I know people say go and see a lot of theatre. It's actually, if you look and you try and get an email the theatres, particularly theatres like the Almeida, like theatres that aren't for profit, there are always cheaper tickets than you think. Like we always have £5 tickets probably every night you can get into a show if you just badger away or drop us an email. So don't, I know price can be intimidating, and it is intimidating, but a lot of theatres are trying really proactively to address that. So if you're passionate, we'll be passionate to try and let you in.
Helen?
I would say, yeah, the bit of advice I've always enjoyed was it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and I guess, you know, there's no rush.
I mean, many people have already said that it's great. The best thing to do is to read plays, but that was the advice that I was given when I was getting ready to audition for drama school, and it served me tenfold because you have a shared reference of the work that you like and the writers that you admire, and maybe who the writers worked with, and like directors like Rupert. And that, yes, exactly as Neil said, if you enjoy reading the plays and going to see as many of them as possible, then that will seem very natural for you to have a career in them. But if it feels quite laborious and tedious to read many plays, it can be hard being an actor. And there are loads of opportunities to see theatre when it's open, to see it for cheap, like the court, the Royal Court in Sloane Square does 10p tickets as well, and there's the entry pass system for the National, which means you can go and see plays for about £7.50, as well as the £5 tickets at the Almeida. So there are some really encouraging ways to get young people to see as much theatre as possible as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, don't worry and take great heart, and just think about, we are going to need all this. This is just great material, all this. There's going to be such a need for storytelling, for theatre making when this ends. And by the way, I don't think it will be over or end in a way that we go back to some formal way of doing theatre. There's going to be whole new ways that, thank God, that's your task. That's what you'll be doing. And you will know better than anybody else how to make theatre for the next generation, because you'll have lived through all this, and it will require new forms. Probably outside on the back of a lorry, the rate we're going, but you know, good luck with that. It's going to be great fun, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think to reiterate that, I mean, I think it can be quite daunting to see a really nice production like this, and like with a beautiful set and a large cast. So I would just encourage people to like also make stuff with the resources that they have available to them. Yeah. As Helen said, like it's a marathon, and so you're only going to be getting better by sort of keeping that practice and failing over and over again. And so I would just encourage that process, and also that to say that your voice is it is valid and valuable to the theatre culture, whether you see yourself on stage or off or not. Yes.
Thank you everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who logged in and watched us today.